Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this week we are looking at chapter 3 in our textbook. And it's interesting because, in order to get a feel for this contemporary history, you kind of have to back up and see what was going on before this whole story starts. So our class sort of officially starts in the 1900s, or 1900, I think is the way the catalog lists it. And as I explained before, we have to go back a little bit earlier to sort of get to the roots of modern histories of these different countries around the world. And so this week we're going to go over to China and Japan, and we're going to try to get to their modern histories. And I think if I could sum up a chapter really easily and quickly, and I'm looking at page 4 of the text, and the author says that when Europeans first appeared off the coast in China in the 16th and 17th centuries, they brought with them dangerous new ideas and values that were strikingly varied or at a variance from what was going on in imperial China. That's an important sentence to frame this lecture and to frame this reading, because what we learn is that China and Japan are both very closed societies, and there's a number of reasons for that. Geography is certainly one of them, and also the tightness and the homogeneity of the cultures, if you will, especially in Japan. I mean, everyone is alike. So as far as race goes, race in Japan is really important. This unique Japanese culture that they're very proud of, and it's the same in China. And the chapter starts in China, actually, but China is a very close society, and China is a society that really views the West as barbarians. And when you really think about Chinese culture and Japanese culture, you see that there are certain ways to do things, and certain processes and certain things in nature that both of these Asian cultures deeply respect, and the West doesn't do things that way. We're not so much for custom in the U.S., very little custom, as a matter of fact. And so Asian cultures have these deep customs that they care a lot about, and that's something that you need to know going into this, because this whole chapter is really talking about Westerners trying to come into Japan and China and Japan trying to deal with the Westerners. And the way they deal with the Westerners, for the most part, is they don't want them there, because, again, the more you read about these histories, you know that when outside elements come into a closed society, things happen. People get ideas. Things start to change. And in Japan, it's not so bad, because it's an island. It's very tightly controlled, and people are very responsive to authority, in a sense, or at least there's a sense of unity, so they generally try to work together on big initiatives. China is a whole different story, because China is so big, and when you look at the area from the maps that influence China, all the way, to Tibet, well, there were a lot of different cultures and races and languages and customs. And anytime you have a situation where you have a really big country or a really big landmass, and a lot of it's rural, it's really hard to get any autonomy. It's really hard for people to identify as one nation. And that's what's happening in China. So sort of the gist of this chapter is China going through this transition from the old imperial ways, think of it in terms of a monarchy, to a more modern society. And so in China, that really starts to happen in the 1850s or so. There's a glorious revolution in 1911 under Sun Yat-sen, and you'll read about it in the book. And what happens is, Sun Yat-sen really represents sort of the last of the old guard, and trying to enact reforms. And again, I think that if you look at the history of China and Japan, you see these rulers in the mid 1800s really scrambling to make reforms, because what's happening is the people are rising up, and a lot of it is from Western influence. So that's sort of that overview. And the interesting stuff in between. China really struggles with Western imperialism. As you read through there in the text, there's a map at one point, and it shows you how China is literally being carved up, by the English and by the Germans at one point, and by the Japanese. So China's vulnerable. They don't have a strong military. They don't have a strong central government at all, because it's just too hard to hold the center together in a country that big, and especially when there's no modern communications. I mean, no one really knows what's going on. Most of the people are illiterate. They're out in the country. They don't know anything about their government in that setting. So it's like herding cats. It's hard to keep people together when they are so far apart physically and culturally. So that's the lesson from China. There's a couple of cool things that pop out. I've been teaching history for a long time. I teach a history of business class, and this China myth always comes out, and I think I'm reading through my notes right now. But the China myth has been there since the late 1700s in the U.S. And the China myth is that U.S. merchants and U.S. manufacturers have always felt like you sell one aspirin to every person in China and you get rich. That the market's so big. The reason that's a myth is that Western cultures didn't realize that the Chinese really didn't want any of their products. Either they didn't want manufactured products, they didn't care about manufactured products, and since most of the people were agrarian or farmers, manufactured goods did nothing for them. So the China myth is out there. The U.S. to this day, all the way up to Nixon, we're trying to get in those China markets, and how ironic now that China controls everything we do as far as markets. So it's sort of a complete flip. So read through it; it's interesting, and one of the things is that's really cool that applies to China, but it applies to all societies. One of the questions is that why did China lag behind industrialization? So you consider the Industrial Revolution in England in the early 1700s, the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. in the mid 1800s, and here it is, the 1900s, and China still really hasn't hit it as a manufacturing powerhouse. And the reasons really are that back then they were really kind of stuck in their old ways. They weren't mechanized, if you will. There was no uniform set of weights and measures in the country. Again, this idea of a large space, people hard to control. There's no uniformity. There's no uniform banking system. There's no transportation system. These are all things that have to be in place before industrialization can occur. Couple other things. So read about the Opium War, because that's sort of a devious thing, and I'll let you discover that on your own. And also read, on page 62, there's a primary source document where someone's speculating whether or not the Chinese can handle democracy. And you'll read that argument about other places around the world. So check that out. It's interesting. And the other thing that's really interesting about China, which is somewhat unique, I think, is that there's no organized religion there. So that's something that is sort of a surprise as you go through these world histories, but you should know that. Know that in some cases, when reforms were happening in the 1900s, that there were more educational opportunities for women, so the culture was starting to open up as far as equality is concerned. And really this idea of urbanization starts to occur in 1911, and anytime you talk about industrialization or industrial revolutions, you always are going to talk about urbanization. They always run hand in hand. In other words, people move to the city where there's jobs. So that's that. As far as Japan goes, the Japan chapter is interesting because, or the Japan section, I should say, because it really opens in 1853. And again, we're trying to get at this point in time when Japanese history becomes contemporary or modern history. But it opens in 1853. Commodore Perry comes to Japan to establish trading. Not Perrysburg, if you're from Ohio, Perrysburg, Ohio, not Oliver Hazard Perry, but actually Commodore Matthew Perry is Oliver Perry's older brother. So if you know Perrysburg and you know the Battle of Lake Erie and you're familiar with local history where I'm at today, Perry's a big name. So the U.S. goes into Japan in the 1850s to try to establish some trade relations. And again, just like the Chinese, the Japanese think that the Americans are heathens. They don't trust them. But at the same time, one of the differences between Japanese relations with the West and Chinese relations with the West is that Japanese do accept Western culture and Western art. And there's a period of time in the Meiji restoration where Western art is accepted and really incorporated with Japanese art. So the book talks about sort of these cultural exchanges, which are interesting. But at the same time, there's never a deep level of trust between the United States and Japan. And Japan, again, is different than China because it builds up this strong military. They can do that because they're a smaller, more cohesive nation. And Japan builds up a surprisingly powerful military, which even attacks Port Arthur in 1904 and humiliates the Russians on their western port to the Pacific Ocean. And, don't worry about knowing all that stuff, but read through it because the point of this is that Japan defeating Russia in it's 1908, I believe, or 1904, I'm sorry, is a big deal. It sort of sends this message, especially to Teddy Roosevelt, who's in the White House, that, hey, Japan is nothing to fool with, that they're becoming a big military power. And obviously we kind of know what's going to happen in the next 30 or 40 years, so I think knowing that Japan builds up its military in the early 1900s kind of makes the story more important. So there's that. As far as social characteristics go, Japan is really open to women in the 1870s. The Japanese workforce in the late 1800s is about 60% women, and women are pushing for equal rights. Again, a little bit later than that first happens in the U.S., but women are definitely a strong force in Japan socially and politically. So there's that part. As far as the quiz is concerned this week, know the differences between China and Japan in the 1800s. So, think about imperialism when you think about that question, and I think you'll get it after you do the reading. Also, know what the Meiji restoration was in the late 19th century. It's a really important part of Japanese history. If I was to equate it with anything in the U.S., I might equate it with the New Deal, perhaps, a time of reform, or maybe perhaps the Progressive Era, which we'll be talking about, this time of reform that we see traveling through the globe, and that's called the Meiji restoration, so make sure you know that. Meiji means enlightened peace, if you wanted to know that. Also, so recurring themes in Chinese history, know what they are, and I'll give you a hint, it's overpopulation. So as you do the reading, you're going to see that comes up again and again, even getting to the extent of population control at one point. So know that stuff, and all of these countries and everything we've been talking about, there's these themes. So the two themes that are really shaping everything right now are imperialism and industrialization, and that's certainly the case in China and Japan as you read through the chapter addressing this time period. And then also on the quiz, it asks you about what was going on in China that indicated rebellion. What instance or what example can you provide from the book that indicates there's rebellion going on in China? So make note, if you read about rebellions in China in this time period, that's going to be a quiz question. So that's it for this week. Sorry I went so long on the lecture. Enjoy the reading. It's really interesting. If you have any questions, let me know. Be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.